Hey, Carlos, how are you doing?
I am doing well. One of the most interesting things that I've been hearing is not only obviously the worry about a fourth surge, but also beginning to see announcements, including for the Tribeca Film Festival, that there might be more in-person live events this summer, which is...
And sports events, right? We're starting to see those open up too. Although, like you, I think one thing we have all learned over the last year is humility. And perhaps
True.
that making too many long-term plans is not wise. Who was it that said plans are made for the gods to laugh at? I feel at the moment perhaps plans are made for the pandemic to laugh at.
Indeed.
Right, let's get on. Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new show exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
Arguably, they are the world's two most powerful nations, but relations between the United States and China haven't been easy recently. It's been a story of sanctions, trade wars, and accusations of human rights abuses. Just a couple of weeks ago, this undiplomatic exchange took place between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi at their meeting in Anchorage, Alaska.
I'm hearing deep satisfaction that the United States is back, that we're re-engaged with our allies and partners. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
外交礼节
Well, I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought that the U.S. side will follow the necessary diplomatic protocols. So let me say here that in front of the Chinese side, the United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
Such frank language is extremely unusual at meetings like this, but as relations appear strained, we should remember that the two nations are also important trading partners. Almost 40% of Amazon's top sellers are based in China. The flow of goods between the two countries is huge. China is a crucial market for American farmers in particular, like Sarah Ricoeur, a fourth-generation sugar beet and soybean farmer with 600 acres in eastern Montana.
So I came back to my family's farm in early 2017, just a couple of months before the tariffs were put into place. And a large portion of, especially our soybean crop, go to China. And went from having one of the projected best years for our small grains, such as soybeans and wheat, to getting paid almost the same price or sometimes even less than my dad was paid when he started farming in 1979. It was an almost instantaneous dollar per bushel loss. And it doesn't sound like a lot if you're not a farmer, but if you're a farmer, $1 a bushel is the difference between making money and losing money. Previous generations ahead of me worked for 30 years to get into places like China and watched their work get flushed down the toilet overnight. But if you're the farmer that's going to lose your fourth or fifth generation farm, it comes down to a real mental strain.
That sounds rough. And it is completely out of Sarah's control because it's been imposed on her as a result of politics. So this week we're asking what the future is of relations between China and America and what are the most likely areas of tension between the two. Our first guest is Robert Daly. He's a former US diplomat who was posted to China. He's now the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center here in Washington. Robert, thanks for joining the program. It seems that Joe Biden came into office at the end of January, and within the space of a couple of months, rhetoric and tension between Beijing and Washington spiked. Is that how you see it?
I wouldn't say that tension and rhetoric spiked because they had been extremely antagonistic throughout the Trump administration and had become more antagonistic in the final year of the Trump administration. Beijing did not, nor did the world get, a reprieve from that. The style of the Biden administration is a little bit different. It's less directly accusatory, but we did, at the opening of the Anchorage meeting, say in public, in front of the world, on camera, that the Chinese were agents of disorder, agents of chaos. So we started with a public insult from China's point of view, and they answered in kind.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get a lot more accusatory than what Tony Blinken was saying to his Chinese counterparts, right?
No, he delivered it in a gentlemanly fashion. There's an American, Isaac Goldberg, said that the art of diplomacy is to do and say the nastiest thing in the nicest way. And that's sort of what Sullivan and Blinken did. But the message was received by China. But China was also primed, ready, looking for an opportunity to give as good as they got and to make accusations toward the United States, which they proceeded to do. So I think both sides are equally to blame in this.
Robert and Katty, I want to bring in our second guest, Kaiser Kuo. He's the editor-at-large at SupChina, a media company focused on explaining China to the West. He's also the founder and the co-host of the Sinica podcast, which discusses all things China. Kaiser was born in the U.S. to Chinese parents. Kaiser, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Carlos.
Kaiser, do you think we've entered into a new and perhaps more dangerous era here in terms of U.S.-China relations, or is this a somewhat foreseeable and predictable continued escalation of tensions of two powers?
I don't think that it was foreseeable or predictable. I certainly do see it, as Robert described it, as a continuation to some extent of what was already a very high level of tension. I worry, though, my biggest fear is that the debate within China is over. The question is settled as to what America's actual intention is. Beijing, I think, has been able to see this previously as, or at least some people within Beijing have been able to see this as peculiar to the Trump administration or to the Republican Party. But now I believe it sees the United States, irrespective of the president of the administration or the party, that the United States ultimately wants to see China on its knees or on its belly to thwart Chinese legitimate aspirations in the world.
And Kaiser, how does that square for those Americans who've heard comments about currency manipulation on the part of China and have heard that kind of commentary now from a decade plus from multiple leaders? They would say that we keep hearing about America wanting fairer dealings, not necessarily China on its knees. How do those square?
If it were just the question of currency, if it were just the question of honoring Chinese WTO commitments, not all of which have been met, and I think there are plenty of people in China who would make that case. If it were just those things, I think we could still come to some accommodation. It's not just those things, though. There is something much, much deeper. There is a deep-rooted psychological discomfiture that Chinese believe that America is experiencing just at seeing China's rise. So it's also kneecapping China's technology companies. It's also gratuitously insulting China and regarding China as the primary cause of the coronavirus epidemic. It's regarding China as an existential threat. I mean, I think that it's gone way beyond that.
Interestingly, Kaiser, Joe Biden last week described the relationship fairly bluntly, almost as an existential one, a battle between democracy and autocracy. And it was pretty clear which countries he thought were the democracy and which countries he thought was the autocracy. Is there a feeling in China now that actually China can stand up for the system it has on a global front and point a finger at democracy as being a system that has its own weaknesses?
Well, I think the difference is that China, while it certainly wants to, as the phrase goes, make the world safe for autocracy, in other words, be able to be an autocratic political system that exists in the world without constantly having to defend its very legitimacy, it does not seek to turn existing democracies into autocracies, whereas it sees the United States as doing exactly that. Wanting to undermine and delegitimate the existing autocracies in the world. So if one side sees it as an existential ideological battle, I think perforce the other side has to sort of frame it that way as well, unfortunately.
Robert, I want to bring you in not just on the question of U.S.-China relations, but recently here in the U.S., we've sadly seen an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Do you think any of the anti-Chinese rhetoric expressed during the pandemic has played a role in that in your mind? Are they connected?
Yes, but it's not just the pandemic. We, of course, have a very long history of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism in the United States that goes back to, the first Chinese coming to this country. So that has never entirely gone away. You then had, layered on top of that, the Trump claim that this was the Kung flu, the China virus, the Wuhan virus, even in some cases, Trump administration officials suggesting that this had been deliberately created by China and released on the world. So that is there. What worries me going forward is that once we come out of COVID, the biggest continuing spur to anti-Chinese, anti-racism in the United States won't be the pandemic. It's going to be worsening U.S.-China relations and the way that those are characterized by politicians, by the media, and throughout the culture. And of course, much of this is also spurred by China's own actions domestically and at home. Not that the racism is spurred by China's actions, but the descriptions of U.S.-China competition, what is at stake, including the ideological part, is in part based on China's real actions. So the question is, how do those of us who describe U.S.-China relations for a living describe them responsibly as they get worse without provoking further racist attacks? We just saw a horrible one yesterday on the subway in New York. This gets worse, not better, in my view.
Yeah, I want to echo Robert. I think that he said it exactly right. It's also the racial profiling and persecution of ethnic Chinese through Trump's rhetoric, Trump saying that he believed most Chinese students in the U.S. were spies, for instance, and through federal law enforcement with the DOJ's China Initiative, which has targeted a lot of, I think, straight up racially profiled ethnically Chinese scientists and researchers. He and his administration continuously just pushed this narrative that China was out to supplant the U.S. as the next global hegemon and, fan flames in other ways. But I think it's also important to say what it isn't. Criticism of the repression of the Uyghurs, for example, in Xinjiang, has not, as far as I can tell, been a direct factor in ginning up the kind of xenophobia that spilled over into the streets and hate. So I think you should criticize the behavior of the Chinese government and not be xenophobic.
It reminds me of some of what we saw about anti-Japanese feeling in the US in the 1980s and 90s. Is it just a fear of being displaced, do you think?
I think there's a big difference that China represents a multidimensional peer competitor. Japan, at most, was, an economic competitor. It would threaten to displace American jobs. Detroit, where we saw Vincent Chin attacked in 1982, that was because of the perception that Japan was taking American auto workers' jobs. There was never a sense that it was going to displace the United States as sort of the global hegemon, the provider of public goods in the world, that the yen would become the global currency or anything like that. And the same with Russia, even. It was an ideological threat to the United States, a weaker and weaker one, but it was certainly a military threat, but it was never an economic competitor in any serious way.
Robert, let's home in on one of those areas where it does seem to be directly confronting US supremacy. I think a lot of people have heard about China's role in Africa, China's role in Latin America, but actually recently we're starting to hear a lot more about China's role in the Middle East. The Chinese Foreign Secretary, having just met Tony Blinken, then went on to the Middle East, to Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran, and signed an investment deal with the Iranians. How much does China threaten the traditional role of influence that the United States has had in the Middle East?
Well, of course, the United States is rethinking its role in the Middle East. It hasn't been very well managed by a number of presidents for decades. So I think it's hard to say that China is directly threatening it. China is, in fact, the major customer for Middle Eastern oil now, replacing us. That's not a direct threat. Those are really just market forces. China has successfully turned this trick of having good relations with Saudi and Iran and Israel and Egypt, something that we haven't been able to do because it's kept these relationships purely transactional. They've been trade-based, but China has assiduously tried not to get involved in the region the way that we've become involved. The big question for China going forward is, can it continue to keep these relationships just about trade and investment when it is actually, from the Middle Eastern point of view, placing a lot of chips on red and on black, on the Sunni and Shia side of this? Can China do that without getting sorts of foreign entanglements that it's tried to avoid? I see China pursuing China's interest in the region. That has implications for us, but it's not aimed at the United States and its interests in the first instance. This is about China's quest for resources and for markets.
Because we see so much Chinese investment now in 5G, in startups, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. There's a ton of Chinese money going into the Middle East. And I think for some Americans, the assumption might be that that is therefore a sort of a new front line in this kind of existential battle for the control of the 21st century. But if China really is thinking about its own self-interest, presumably it is in China's self-interest, because of the oil supplies, that the region stays peaceful. I mean, is this counterintuitively perhaps an area of the world where the US and China might actually be able to work together to ensure an outcome that is good for both of them?
I think that if they each pursue their interests in the area separately but in parallel and effectively, that could indeed be very good for the area. I don't see really channels for them to actively cooperate, but rational policy in the more rational countries in the Middle East could work out fairly well for all concerned. The American concern tends to be not so much Chinese investment, but the nature of Chinese investment, the practices which tend to be not transparent, and the conditionality. When the Biden administration says that China wants to affect global norms, what it means is that China's investment, China's largesse as it sees it, tends to come with conditions. You know, the Communist Party would like to have its practices accepted without objection and without obstacle, which tends towards illiberal practices. So it's in these second-order effects of Chinese investment that we get a problem for the United States. But to date, I don't think that there's anything targeted at the United States or really malicious in the area that I've heard of that we need to be attentive to.
Robert, we heard at the beginning of the program Sarah talking about her farm and how much it was affected by trade policy between the US and China. I mean, however much tension there is, just the very fact of the amount of American debt that China holds suggests these two countries are going to have to work together economically, doesn't it? They both depend on each other's economic good fortunes.
Certainly an economic decoupling, even if it were possible, would be debilitating for both countries' economies. And it's not just the debt that China holds. It's the fact that many Chinese are heavily invested here. Many Americans are increasingly invested in China's economy by buying sovereign debt, by buying Chinese equities, by investing their pensions within China. At the same time, there are pressures for some economic decoupling. China, Russia, and other countries are very interested in getting away from the American-controlled SWIFT payment system that we use to impose sanctions on other countries. If they set up a separate international payment system and we have mutually exclusive payment systems, we'll see an increase in pressures for the two countries to pull apart. But as of today, as you suggest, the countries are highly integrated and are not yet willing to pay the costs of a true decoupling.
Robert, let me ask you a little bit about China's leader, Xi, and how Xi is thinking about what comes next for the U.S. and China.
I think two things primarily. The first is that this guy, he's very consistent, he's very confident, and he's all about control. One of his most famous sayings is that north, south, east, west, and center in the military, in party matters, in civil matters, in academia, the party leads everything, by which he means controls everything. And so that Xi is moving China from developmental authoritarianism toward a sort of developmental, technologically enabled totalitarianism. That's one. Number two, and this comes up a lot in the statements of China's ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, when he says that China is not seeking to replace the United States. And Americans don't know how to process that. The way I understand his statement is that almost everything China is doing for China's sake, to increase its security, its prosperity in various ways. So we tend to see an awful lot of Chinese actions as aimed at us. But they're not at us. They are for China. Now, a lot of these policies have implications for us, including security implications, and we have to counter China, and we do have to compete with China. But it's not true that China, in the first instance, seeks America's harm or to overtake the United States. It doesn't care that much about the United States. It's a highly self-regarding place which is doing what it does for China itself.
Kaiser, give me a going-forward view in which what has been a tense relationship gets to better ground. Do you have a view of this relationship where things could turn a corner and get to a much better place?
I think that one thing that has been absent completely during the Trump administration, certainly after the trade talks broke off, was there's been an utter absence of diplomacy. That is back. We do know there's now back-channeling happening again where there wasn't before. I think that there's a little bit of stagecraft that can be done in coordination with China, even around things like the Anchorage summit, which looked just so contentious. Maybe that was mainly on the surface, and that beneath the surface, once the cameras were off and the media wasn't present, some things perhaps got done. That's how some people have spun it. Maybe that's happening now. There's a lot of kicking each other under the table to say, what I'm about to say now doesn't count. That I think is probably wishful thinking, though, on my part. It really looks like things have shifted. And my worry is that it's going to foreclose the possibility of the badly needed cooperation we need to resolve some issues of global importance. Things obviously like another pandemic, which won't necessarily start in China, but certainly will require China's participation to prevent it. And of course, global warming, but also, nuclear nonproliferation, handling the North Korea situation, cybercrime, cyberterrorism.
Let me ask a slightly different question, the generational one. Xi, the leader of China, is in his late 60s. Biden's in his late 70s. But there's whole generations, Gen Z, millennials, that may just bring a very different view to this opportunity. I'm just trying to think about would a generational shift create new and better opportunities for the two countries?
I suggest that we not pin too much hope on this. If you look at the attitudes that are held, especially in Gen Z in China, they're significantly more nationalistic, more, let's not use the word nationalism, maybe confident. They're really confident at a national level. They don't appear ready to simply forget the lessons of patriotic education that have been drilled into them from their early youth. But, more importantly, I think they see organic reasons. They're not blind to what's happening in the world. They see the United States in its utter failure to address the COVID-19 pandemic, and they look at their own domestic response, and they're, I think, understandably very proud of what China was able to do. I think there were a lot of reasons not to be optimistic. There are some issues, though, and some of the really, really big ones where I think that a die-off of older people who are just so emotionally invested will probably do good things, like Taiwan, for example. I don't think that that's a situation where if we kick the can down the road a little further, the generations will make that a less volatile issue.
That's really interesting, and that the fact that the younger generation are more nationalistic in China. And Robert, I wanted to ask you about the Uyghurs. Here in the US over the last year, we have seen young people flooding the streets, demanding social change, demanding racial justice in the United States. It doesn't sound, from what Kaiser is saying, that we can look to younger Chinese to ask for similar treatment of the Uyghurs in China, that it doesn't sound like that voice for social change is going to come from younger Chinese.
No, I don't think it will. In fact, if we do a thought experiment, if China were to become politically pluralistic and democratic now, it does not follow that young Chinese or all Chinese would therefore see Hong Kong, Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang as more autonomous. They may well have the same ideas about Chinese territory as an autocratic China has. But all of that said, China is changing. The story of modern China is a story of change. Under Xi Jinping, a lot of these changes have been retrograde and regrettable, but there's still a lot going on that is worthy of our attention. We have, for example, young people in the cities protesting against the 80-hour work week at the tech companies. They're starting to kick back against that. We have women in comedy clubs, through rock and roll, through lawsuits, protesting against the chauvinistic society and the treatment of women. So the Chinese people themselves, the young people, while they're not advocating for changes in attitudes toward Taiwan or Xinjiang, many of them are saying, we want to live differently. And the government has to respond to a good deal of that. So change hasn't stopped in China. And that's one of the things that we have to keep a very careful eye on going forward. I think that it's change in both countries that is our greatest hope going forward. I'm not optimistic in the short or medium term, but we need to keep track of China's changes.
Let me add something very quickly to what Robert just said. Our policies right now are possibly pushing a lot of these young people out of our reach, where they might have been people whose sympathies and empathies are naturally occurring empathies toward their countrymen who are being put in camps or in forced labor. that empathy is being pushed out of reach right now by our own policies. And we really need to think about ways where we can actually engage with that, where we can activate that rather than galvanize them and push them further away.
Robert Daly, Kaiser Kuo, thank you both for joining us. What a fantastic and interesting conversation.
So interesting. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I feel we've taken a look inside China, not just a look at China and the relationship with the U.S.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Carlos, I thought what we were talking about just actually at the end of the program there was so interesting on the next generation of Chinese. And I think often our assumption is that young people are young people are young people. And in some ways, clearly, they are. But this sort of strand of emerging nationalism amongst younger Chinese and confidence in their own country, I think, is really interesting and one to watch.
And I still think, Katty, this decade will ultimately yield another country or three that will play a more prominent role on the global stage. And so while we increasingly think about a U.S.-China dynamic, at least here in the U.S. we do, or in some cases a little bit of a U.S.-Russia dynamic, I'm curious to see what will be some of the other countries that will be in the mix as the 2020s evolve.
And whether those countries will have to pick a side between China and the United States. That will be one to watch too.
Yeah, or create their own lane.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll be back soon.